approach is the idea of we're essentially looking at the shocking statements that Jesus has made. And I think for anyone who's ever read portions of the Bible or read through the biographies of Jesus in the Bible, also known as the Gospels, or Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as we title them, there's things that Jesus say that kind of stop you in your tracks. That you may try to rush through them quickly, or you may try to just ignore them and just kind of move on and think that's just way too over the top, and never actually begin to deal with them. And so I thought, wouldn't it be interesting for us to actually talk about some of these shocking statements that Jesus has made? And so we don't just simply deal with the comments that Jesus makes that maybe are more palatable and are more easily to understand, but let's just kind of land on some of these statements and begin to wrestle with them, and maybe not always come up with the exact right answer, but at least to begin to see, okay, what does this mean for us in the midst of our life? And so this morning we're going to read a statement that came fairly early in Jesus' ministry. And Jesus has people who have gathered around them, and it's often referred to as the Sermon on the Mount, and for good reason, because Jesus is speaking on the side of like a hillside, so that's where the title came from. And Jesus is really teaching and giving a real approach to, okay, what does it begin to look like if you want to follow me, if you want to be my disciples, which seems rather fair, right? Jesus is telling people to follow him, and so it only makes sense that he begins to say, okay, this is the reality of what it's going to look like. And what Jesus often does is he goes back and starts with what they already know, right? So in the Old Testament, in the books that were written, the people had been understanding what was taking place. And so Jesus uses the Old Testament as a point of reference to kind of say, okay, there's some different expectations that I'm going to bring to you. And so it's with that little bit of a background we land on Matthew 5:27 to 30. And I'm just going to read it for you here. Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery,'" which takes us back again to the Old Testament, where people say, okay, I've heard that somewhere. Moses talked about this. Yeah, 10 commandments. Okay, I'm good. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery. But Jesus says, I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, this is where it gets interesting, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. And there it is. Wow, if you're just joining us this Sunday morning, welcome. What a great Sunday for you to show up on. You're probably thinking, maybe this church isn't the church for me. Or maybe there's some people who look at this verse and say, this is exactly the kind of stuff that prevents me from wanting to follow Jesus. Because it's over the top. It's extreme. It's outrageous. It's gross. I mean, I wear glasses because I cannot physically touch my eye with a contact lens, and so to read something like this freaks me out. Like, gouge out your eye, cut off your arm? Jesus, why? Like, why would you even say that? Like, what's going on? And I think there's kind of two dangers we fall into. One danger that really isn't a danger, and that is to say, I'm going to take this literally. Jesus said it, he must have meant exactly what he said. And so if I'm struggling in this area of lust in my life, if I see someone and my mind starts to take me in places I know would not be honoring to God, obviously the only thing left for me to do is to gouge out my eyes. Or if my right arm is causing me something that I shouldn't be doing, it's causing me to pick up something I shouldn't be reading, or to turn the channel. Well, they wouldn't think of turning the channel in Jesus' day. But imagine, it's like it's causing me to do something I shouldn't be doing. I'm just going to cut the thing off. See, I don't really worry that that's an actual danger, because I walk around and I look out there and I don't see anyone having cut off their right arm or gouged out their eyes. The concern for me is that we don't take it seriously enough. That we read these statements that are so shocking that we quickly dismiss it and then move on. And we dismiss it by thinking, of course Jesus doesn't mean pluck out his eye. Of course Jesus doesn't mean cut off his arm. I'm not going to worry about temptation. I'm not going to worry about lust. I don't think Jesus really meant what he said, and we move on. But I think Jesus actually chose these words deliberately to stop us in our tracks and to shock us into a place of stopping and taking a breath and a moment to consider what he's saying. I would actually argue that this statement that Jesus makes, as hard as it is sometimes to digest, is actually yet another indicator of God's love for us. You may think that's a bit of a stretch, but if I'm right in understanding that the Bible is all about God's desire to be in relationship with us, if I'm right about the idea that what Jesus wants, as he says it in other passages, that what he desires is that we live the abundant life, a life truly worth living, and that if God loves us more than anyone else could possibly love us, then maybe it makes sense that Jesus, when teaching us and encouraging us to live a certain way, is doing so because of his love. And he wants to stop us and prevent us from going down a path that could ultimately lead to destruction, even if we don't see it right before us. I'm not going to ask for examples. I'm sure you can quickly recall to mind. There have been situations where someone you love may be doing something that could be harmful to them, and so you shout out or you say something that is so over the top, they literally have to stop and think, what did you just say? Like you literally shock them into a place of actually considering what it is they're doing. And I believe that's the path that Jesus is desiring to go. Because Jesus first equates lust with adultery. And then he says it would actually be better. You think, okay, so cutting off my arm or plucking out my eye is better than what, Jesus? He says, well, I'll tell you, it's actually better than being cast, than to be thrown into hell. And then there's that word, the word hell. Right? That's a word that as soon as it's uttered, suddenly all these images and ideas and beliefs and theology begins to start running around in our mind. It's probably too obvious, but I'm going to say it anyways. When Jesus was first speaking, he wasn't speaking in English. That the translations we have are translated from the original language. And so the original word that Jesus uses is the word Gehenna. Now to us, it doesn't mean a whole lot. We typically translate it as hell. But in Jesus' day, Gehenna was an actual place just outside of Jerusalem. It was actually the garbage dump for Jerusalem. Now, dumps in Jesus' day were not like dumps in our day, right? We're environmentally conscious. We recycle, we separate, we take chemical waste and other not nice things to certain areas and then other things, and so we separate it out. But if you've ever seen on TV or if you've ever visited overseas to a developing country and you see some of the garbage dumps there, they are unpleasant, nasty places to be. They are ripe with disease and decay and rodents, and there's oftentimes fires that are burning, and so it was not a nice place to be. And so when Jesus is saying, listen, you need to get this under control because it's better than being cast in Gehenna, into hell, I believe the first place the original listeners would have gone to is, that nasty dump outside of Jerusalem. you're right, Jesus. What's the parallel here? And so I begin to think that perhaps what Jesus is saying in his shocking statement is, listen, if you don't get lust, if you don't get sex under control, you're going down a path that could potentially rot and destroy your life. You see, the interesting thing about temptation, the interesting thing about sin, is temptation is often the good, pleasurable things that God has given to us, that God has created. And sin twists it and turns it and uses it against us. I mean, the reality is we're not really tempted by things that hurt us. We're not really tempted by things that dislike us or are not enjoyable, right? We're tempted by the things that are good. We just want to go beyond the bounds and the reality of how God has created them for us. And there's no better example than the issue of sex. And so now we begin to look at this situation. There's many other temptations we could talk about, but we're going to focus in on what Jesus was dealing with in this place. So often we think that within the church or within the Bible, or we hear Jesus make a statement like this, we think, Jesus is such a prude. Like, why would he say such a thing? Like, the Bible is always so restrictive and God, but we need to take a step back and realize that it was God who created and gave us the joy of sex. Right, now it's starting getting a little bit more hot and awkward in here, right? First we're talking about self-mutilation, and now we're going to talk about sex in church. Joel, I swear if you don't stop, I'm never bringing another friend on a Sunday morning. But you can't get up and leave because you're all sitting down, and if you get up and walk out, it'll be awkward for everybody here, right? But if you go back to the book of Genesis, you begin to see the reality of what God has given to us. When God is creating the world, and on the sixth day he creates man and he creates woman, Adam and Eve. And he tells them essentially really 4 things they need to do. 4 things, in no particular order. Number 1, in Genesis, God tells Adam, hey, look around, Adam. There's a lot of animals running around. You need to name these things. You can't just say that thing and this thing and what is that. You need to start naming these things. And so what does Adam do? He names all the animals. That's kind of first thing God told him to do. He did a pretty good job. I mean, there's some pretty amazing names out there. Second thing he does is he says to Adam and Eve, he says, listen, I've created this amazing garden for you to live in and for you to enjoy, but now you are going to be the stewards. You are now going to manage this garden. And so take care of this garden, which, could maybe done a better job, hasn't been handed off too well. But anyways, that was the second thing they've been asked to do. Third thing is God says, see that tree in the middle of the garden. Yeah, don't eat from that tree. And we kind of know how that one went. Third thing is he says to Adam and Eve, be fruitful. Be fruitful. That's God speak for have sex, right? Now some will say, well, I said be fruitful and multiply, so, should it be enjoyed? Is it pleasurable? And read Song of Solomon, right? That is a book that's in the Bible that talks specifically about what God desires for us within the bounds of a relationship, in the bounds between a husband and a wife. And yet what happens so often, what was happening in Jesus' day, is that they were taking this gift that God had given to them, and they had gone beyond what God had expected them to use it for. They had twisted it. They had turned it. It suddenly became an appetite for them to indulge in. And so what is Jesus warning them of? The danger of sex. The danger that lust can often bring us into. And what's interesting is Jesus was speaking 2,000 years ago. And the times haven't really changed. I mean, we live in a sex-saturated culture. Turn on the radio. I don't care what genre of music you listen to. Okay, other than Christian music, but anything else on the radio. No one's really singing about their dog or their job anymore. It's all like the same message. You watch movies, you watch television shows, you read magazines, you see advertising, you see it time and time again. It's being brought forth before you. I mean, there's times you watch commercials and you're struggling to try to figure out, what is the product they're actually trying to sell me? You see the rise of pornography. And I don't have the stats, but we see this as becoming a greater issue in the world in which we live. And so what is Jesus saying? We need to desperately get this under control. We need to begin to figure this out, because it may start off as seemingly not too much, but then as temptation does, it lures us further and further and further down the road, until suddenly we get into a place that we never intended ourselves to go. Tim Keller, who's a pastor in New York City, describes the problem with lust is really twofold. One is it undervalues this gift that God has given to us. We view sex just simply as a physical act, as opposed to understanding that God intended this to be the physical act that spoke to such a greater reality, a reality of intimacy. The other side of the equation is that we overvalue it. It suddenly begins to consume us and overtake us, so that suddenly our desires and our urges bring us a sense of identity, and we think we find security, and we pursue it, and we pursue it, and we pursue it. But in both cases, whether we overvalue or undervalue, it begins to destroy and to decay our lives. Jesus says something so shocking that I believe, in the hopes of allowing us to simply stop and think, how is this taking place in my life? What do I have this fully under control? I'm often interested by the origin of sayings. We often, say something and we don't really know exactly where it all began or where it came from. I was watching a TV show the other day, and they said, that person's going to take them out to the woodshed. We know what that means. When you get taken out to the woodshed, it means you're in trouble. You're in big trouble, right? I have no idea where that saying comes from. If you do, I'd love to hear afterwards. Or the other one, I don't know why I'm thinking of getting in trouble, but if someone runs up one side and down the other side of you, you're not a good place. Well, there's a saying that we actually say regularly that I think could be attributed to Jesus. And it's a saying that often gets said when someone has found themselves in a place of regret. When they have done something, or they find themselves in a place where they wish they could just go back, where they wish they could turn back the clock. And what do they say? If I could go back and do things over, I would give my... Let's try that better. I think we know this saying. If I could return and go back, I would give my right arm. Right? And Jesus is saying, hey, I'm ahead of the curve. I can tell you where this is heading. Don't make choices that are going to be unhelpful, that are going to be unhealthy, that get you in such a place of regret that now you may start listening to me. Jesus is saying, I know what is best for your life. And so how do we respond? How do we respond in practical ways here today? I think there's some really helpful things that Jesus talks about. When Jesus speaks about gouging out our eye, I think Jesus is shocking us into a place of saying, consider your view. Consider how it is that you are viewing this temptation in your life. Perhaps the first place is to say, you know what, Jesus isn't being over the top. This is a problem. This is a concern. And it doesn't matter how old, how young, whether married or unmarried, this can be an issue. Perhaps changing our view means we begin to understand the consequences of our actions. That far too often we step into temptation and we step into these areas without fully working it all the way down the road and seeing, is this the path that I want to lead? Is this the baggage that I want to carry? How does that begin to change the choices and the decisions that I make? You see, it's interesting. When historians look at the early church, there was a number of markers, but there were two considerable things that distinguished followers of Jesus from the rest of culture. And that was their view on sex and money. You see, in the culture of Jesus' day, people held on to their money and their possessions incredibly tightly. They would share their possessions with no one. Their bed, open game. They were incredibly loose with their sex life. So they were tight with their money and loose with their bed. Followers of Jesus came and actually switched it around and said, we will be loose, we will be extravagant with our stuff. We will share our things with everyone and anyone, but not our bed. And because of their view on these positions, it began to radically and dramatically transform this movement of Jesus. And so perhaps the very first place we begin is by saying, I need to actually think this through. I need to actually see, is my view tainted and distorted? Do I have the wrong understanding? The second thing I would suggest is when Jesus says, cut off your arm, it's the idea of, are there certain behaviors that we need to stop doing? That at the outset may seem extravagant, may seem over the top, may seem like too much. And I'm not going to say what they are because it is personal for all of us, but maybe there are certain things in our life that we need to stop doing so that we will not be lured further and further and further down the path of temptation. I spoke last year about the reality of guardrails. I'm sure we all know what guardrails are. You drive along the road and you see these guardrails on the side of the road that prevent you from going off the road, into the ditch, down the cliff, whatever. Guardrails are set up in areas that you can actually drive in safely, but we put them there intentionally to prevent us from greater danger beyond. And so perhaps what we need to do is set up guardrails in our own life. Personal realities that we say, I will not go beyond that because I'd rather rub up against a guardrail than flip my car. Right? I mean, you hit a guardrail, you mess up your paint, you got a few dents. Yes, there is some damage, but if you go off the edge of the road, damage multiplies. And I think the same is true in our own lives, that we need to set up these guardrails in our lives so that we will not go down the path that can cause even greater destruction. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians, speaking to a group of Christians, says these words. He says, so if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall into temptation, that you don't fall. It's Paul just simply saying, don't become so comfortable in your life that you think you've got it all sorted out. He says, no temptation has overcome you except that which is common to others. And God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Paul is saying, listen, be aware of the temptations of this world. But he's also saying, you can't do it on your own. Which is why it brings us back to Jesus. Which is why it brings us back to the table. A reminder again that in order for us to truly follow in the ways of Jesus, it's not just about trying harder. It's not just about digging down deeper. It's about coming to the place of saying, Jesus, I need you in this. Strengthen me. Enable me to follow through on such things that seem far too over the top. It's a consistent theme in the New Testament. That in the midst of our struggles, we don't just try harder, we turn back to Jesus. The writer of Hebrews says, always focus on Jesus, because he too was tempted in every way, except he was without sin. Therefore, come to Jesus where you will receive mercy and you will find grace. I have no idea what situations you may find yourself in. Again, whether you're married, whether you're single, whether you're young, whether you're old, this reality is true for us all. And my concern isn't that we will take Jesus literally on his words. My concern is that we will just brush it off too quickly and then move on. When Jesus, like a loving parent, is jumping up and down and waving his arms and shouting as loud as he can, take notice, take notice. I want you to have life. I want you to have abundance. And not dealing with this area of temptation is not going to lead you in the direction that I desire for you. And so this week, I just ask you to consider these words, to consider the words that Jesus has spoken, and begin to ask, what must I begin doing? Or maybe what must I stop doing? So that Jesus, you are not simply the one I talk about, but you are the one that I follow in the midst of all of life. Let us pray together. And so Jesus, as we come before you this day,